I will never forget that sound, not because it was loud or dramatic or violent, but because it wasn't supposed to exist in my home. It was the kind of broken, strangled sob a person makes when they're trying not to scream when the soul tears long before the body does. A sound pulled upward from somewhere deep, somewhere private, somewhere that should have been unreachable. I remember how my hand hesitated on the doorknob. I remember how the house felt too still, as if holding its breath. And I remember how, for the first time in years, something inside me whispered, "Linda, step back." But I didn't. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, and the world I knew, my safe, familiar, ordinary world, shifted. Mark was sitting on the edge of the sofa, completely motionless, not resting, not thinking, frozen. His shoulders hunched in a way I had never seen, as if the weight of something invisible had forced his body inward. His face was colorless, drained of life. And his eyes, those calm, warm eyes I had trusted for decades, were wide with a terror so naked it made my stomach drop. "Mark," my voice broke without my permission. He tried to stand, but his legs refused to obey. His knees shook, and his hands fluttered uselessly at his sides. He moved like a man whose body had just remembered fear after years of forgetting it. "Linda." His lips shaped the word, but no sound came out. The silence that followed wasn't normal silence. It was charged like static before lightning strikes. I took a slow step toward him, not wanting to startle him. The room around us felt too small, too heavy. Even the air seemed colder. My heartbeat wasn't frantic, not yet, but I could feel it shifting, bracing, preparing for something I didn't want to face. And in that moment, between his trembling mouth and my breath catching halfway up my throat, I knew something terrible had happened. Something that didn't belong in our marriage, in our home, in the life we had built. But the worst part wasn't the shock or the fear or even the confusion. It was the realization that I had no idea what role I played in this moment. Whether I was the comfort he needed or the person he wanted to hide from. A wife who suddenly didn't recognize her own husband, a stranger in her own living room. I approached him, slowly, deliberately, like walking toward a wounded animal, unsure whether to run or bite. "Mark, look at me." His eyes did move just slightly enough for me to see the fractures in them. Not the kind created by pain, but by panic, by something that had already happened, something that couldn't be undone. He inhaled sharply, and the sound shivered through him like cold water. I reached for his hands. They were ice. He flinched. My chest tightened so violently it hurt. He had never flinched from my touch. Not in anger, not in frustration, not even in our worst days. But now he recoiled like I had burned him. "Mark," I said again, softer, steadier, "tell me what's wrong." He opened his mouth a second time. Nothing came out. A single tear slipped down the corner of his eye. Another followed, not the kind that falls freely, but the kind held back until resistance breaks. He swallowed a gasp, then another, and pressed both hands to his face, as if trying to hold himself together. I could hear the tremor in his breath. I could feel the tremor in mine. Part of me wanted to hold him, to wrap my arms around him the way I used to when life became too heavy. Another part, one I didn't yet understand, held me back. My instincts, usually calm and dependable, felt scattered, conflicted, alert. My marriage was built on knowing this man. And now I wasn't sure I knew anything at all. I sat beside him slowly, carefully leaving enough space for him to breathe. He didn't look at me. His fingers twitched against his knees, restless, frantic, like a man who had just escaped something, or someone. "What happened?" I kept my voice low, steady, almost whisper soft. No answer, just that awful, aching silence between us, a silence that felt like a message in itself. I studied him not the way a wife studies a husband, but the way a nurse studies a patient or a therapist studies a wound. His shoulders shook with every breath. His eyes darted toward the hallway the way frightened people look at doorways, not for an exit, but for a threat. That frightened me more than anything else. "Mark," I murmured, "is someone here?" His head jerked the movement, small but sharp. I followed his gaze toward the corridor, toward the place where the house dipped into shadow. Nothing moved, but the hair at the back of my neck stood on end. He squeezed his fists until his knuckles whitened. I could see him fighting his own thoughts the way a person fights the urge to confess something too dangerous to say aloud. When he finally whispered, his voice was barely a ghost, "I shouldn't have been here alone." A chill slid down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. He didn't answer. His gaze dropped to his hands as if the truth was written on his palms and he didn't want me to see it. I felt something shift in me, an instinctive, old, primal fear. Not fear of a crime or an accident, but fear of betrayal, fear of the unknown, fear of secrets kept by the person closest to you. "Mark," I said, "did someone hurt you?" His breath caught, his chin trembled. Then finally, he nodded. My blood went cold. Not because he said yes, but because he said it like he expected me to already know. He lifted his sleeve, hesitant, ashamed, and I saw the faint shadow of a bruise on his wrist. Not a fresh one, not accidental. A mark made by fingers with purpose, hands that held too tightly. Someone strong enough to frighten him. Someone close enough to touch him. A cold, electric realization pierced me. But before I could speak, before I could even process what that meant, Mark suddenly grabbed my wrist, not roughly but urgently, and whispered, "Linda, please, don't ask me anything else." My heart dropped. "Honey, why?" He shook his head rapidly, the motion frantic, terrified. I can't. A breath. I can't tell you." His grip loosened, his shoulders collapsed inward. He looked like a man who had been carrying something alone for too long. Anger would have been easier for me. Or an affair, or a lie, or anything with clear edges. But his fear was formless, shapeless, spreading into the corners of the room and into the corners of my mind. I wanted to hold him, but I also wanted answers. And for the first time, I didn't know which instinct to trust. "What happened today?" I asked again, trying to steady myself. "Just today. Start there." He closed his eyes tight like someone bracing for impact. When he finally opened them, the look he gave me wasn't love or relief, it was warning. "Linda," he whispered, voice shaking, "whatever you do, don't trust." A sudden noise echoed from the back of the house, a soft thud, barely audible. He froze. I froze. And in that suspended breath between us, my entire world shifted again. He slowly lifted his trembling hand and pointed toward the hallway, shrouded in quiet. My pulse thundered in my ears. His voice cracked as he whispered a single word, "Please, don't go there." And in that moment, I understood something terrifying. I was no longer just a wife coming home. I was a woman standing at the edge of a truth she never asked for, but one that had already begun to swallow her life whole. I called his name again. Once, twice, a third time. Each attempt softer than the one before, as if lowering my voice could somehow coax him back into himself. But Mark only trembled harder. He kept his gaze fixed on the floor, blinking rapidly like someone trying to outrun a memory. What terrified me most wasn't the panic, it was the way he refused to look at me. As if my face, the face he had loved for decades, had suddenly become unbearable. My pulse hammered through my ribs. A faint ringing started in my ears. My hands felt cold in a way that didn't come from temperature. Something was wrong. Wrong in a way that seeped into the walls, into the silence, into me. And then a footstep in the hallway. Ethan, my son. He emerged with the subtle violence of someone stepping out of a lie. His hair was messy, sticking to his forehead as if he'd run his hands through it 100 times. His breath came too fast, too shallow, too controlled. And he wouldn't meet my eyes, not for a second. "Mom." His voice floated toward me, gentle, careful, too careful. "When I got here, Dad was already like this. Already like this." The phrasing landed wrong. Rehearsed. chosen deliberately. I tried to look at him the way mothers are supposed to, softly with trust, but something inside me recoiled, something old and instinctive. The air around him felt off, as though the guilt on his skin hadn't settled yet, still warm from being carried. "Ethan," I whispered, "why are you out of breath?" He froze for the tiniest fraction of a second. A crack, a fracture. Then he forced a small, tight smile and shrugged. I was upstairs. I heard Dad making noises. I came down too fast, too fast. His explanation didn't match the rhythm of his breath, didn't match the tension in his jaw, didn't match the tremor beneath his words. And then his eyes flicked toward Mark just briefly, and something in that look made my stomach turn. Not concern, not fear, but calculation. Something cold pushed into my chest. I turned back to Mark, kneeling in front of him. He shrank from my touch again, and that hurt more than I expected. The flinch was small, but it was real. Too real. "Mark." "Sweetheart, look at me," I begged softly. His lips parted like he wanted to speak, but nothing came out except a faint, wounded sound, half breath, half sob. And that's when I saw it. A faint bruise, barely visible, peeking out from beneath the cuff of his sleeve. A muted purple blooming along his wrist, the unmistakable shape of fingers. My heart didn't just drop, it shattered. I reached for his arm on instinct, but he yanked it back, cradling it close to his chest like a secret he wasn't ready to expose. Behind me, Ethan shifted his weight. A small movement, but loud enough to feel like thunder. I turned slowly toward him. He still wouldn't look at me. "What happened here?" I asked. My voice trembled. I hated that it did. He swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing sharply. "Mom, I told you. I found Dad like this." His speech sounded practiced. Not the message, the delivery. As if he'd polished it before stepping out into the hallway. "Did you touch him?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. Ethan's head snapped up. The shock in his eyes was quick, too quick, before morphing into something defensive. "What? No." "Why would you even but?" The sentence broke halfway, like his breath couldn't push it through. He looked hurt, but not the kind of hurt that comes from innocence, the kind that comes from being cornered. I could feel the room tightening around us, the tension straining like a rope pulled too far. Mark whimpered. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for my soul to twist. I turned back toward him. His eyes were clenched shut, his body curling in on itself as if bracing for another blow, or reliving one. My son took a step closer. Instinct made me rise to my feet, placing my body between them with a subtlety I hoped neither would notice. But Ethan's eyes flickered with something sharp, a glint of frustration perhaps, or something darker quickly hidden. "Mom," he repeated, softer, "now you're overreacting. Dad probably fell. He's been tired. You know he has." Tired. Fell. Excuses offered too quickly, fitted too neatly. Mark's breathing hitched. Ethan didn't seem to notice, or didn't care. I kneaded my hands together, trying to steady my thoughts. Every instinct tugged me in a different direction. Protect Mark, question Ethan, understand the bruise, decipher the silence. But beneath all of that was something more primal. The sense that truth was standing in the room with us, watching, waiting, deciding which one of us was brave enough to drag it into the light. I turned back to Ethan. "What were you and your father talking about earlier?" His reaction was immediate and unmistakable. A freeze. Not physical, mental. Like his thoughts collided with a wall he hadn't expected. What he asked too quickly. "I heard you," I lied. Before I opened the door. Voices. Raised voices. I hadn't heard anything. But a lie is sometimes a key, the right kind unlocks what a truth never could. His breath stumbled. "No, no, Mom. We didn't talk. I swear." He wasn't looking at me anymore. His gaze slid to the side, avoiding, dodging, retreating. and in the corner of my vision, Mark curled even smaller, shaking his head faintly, as if begging for the moment to disappear. My throat tightened around the weight of understanding. Something had happened between the two of them. Something raw, something violent, and Ethan was terrified I could see it. I knelt beside Mark again, gently brushing the hair from his forehead. "Honey, did you fall?" His head jerked once. Not no, not yes. Just a flinch, a reflexive denial of something too painful to name. Ethan stepped forward. "Mom, stop!" "He's confused." "You're making it worse." His words were thin, but the edge beneath them was not. For the first time, I felt it clearly, fear not for him, but of him. It was small, a seed barely planted, but seeds grow roots when given enough shadows. "Sweetheart," I said, my gaze still on Mark, "why won't you look at me?" A tear slipped down the side of his nose. He whispered something I couldn't catch. Barely a breath, barely a word. I leaned closer. "Mark, say it again." But he shook his head violently, as if speaking would break something inside him for good. Behind me, Ethan sighed, weary, irritable. "Mom, please. Can we not do this now? It's just Dad's tired. I'm tired. You're tired. We don't need to." But he stopped abruptly. Because I looked at him then. Really looked. And my eyes landed on something I had missed, small red marks on his knuckles. Faint, fresh. Skin irritated in the way skin becomes when a person grips something or someone with too much force. A slow, cold breath left my lungs, the bruises on Mark's wrist, the trembling, the silence, and now this, Ethan. My voice was barely audible. "What did you do?" He stiffened, his jaw clenched. His lashes fluttered once, a single flash of panic, before he smothered it under a neutral expression that didn't fool me at all. "Mom," he said quietly, "don't start. Don't start." My own son, the boy whose fever I had stayed awake through, whose nightmares I had soothed, whose scraped knees I had kissed, was speaking to me like a man with something to protect, or something to hide. I straightened slowly, placing one hand on Mark's shoulder. He leaned into the touch like someone starved for comfort. Ethan's jaw tightened as he watched the gesture, and in that small, silent triangle, mother, father, son, something irrevocable shifted. I drew a shaky breath. "Ethan," I said, "I need you to tell me the truth." He looked at me with eyes that were suddenly unreadable. Too dark, too still. "I already told you the truth," he said, but it wasn't an answer. It was a warning. And for the first time in my life, I didn't recognize the boy standing in front of me. When I placed my hand on Mark's shoulder, his whole body jolted beneath my touch, not like a startled man, but like someone whose skin remembered pain before his mind did. A flinch born from something done in silence. His breath caught. His eyes squeezed shut. And for the first time in our marriage, my husband recoiled from me as though my touch pressed directly against a wound I could not see. I pulled my hand back slowly, gently, as if disengaging from the fragile shell he had become. Every instinct in me screamed to hold him, to pull him into my arms, to protect him the way I once did when life overwhelmed him. But this wasn't overwhelm. This wasn't exhaustion. This was fear. A fear with a shape I couldn't quite name yet. Behind me, Ethan paced the room restlessly. Forward, pause, back again. A pattern without rhythm, like steps guided by panic rather than purpose. He filled the space between our breaths with fragments of sentences that didn't connect. Half-finished explanations, meaningless reassurances, nervous chuckles that died too quickly. "Mom, It's probably nothing, you know. Dad just gets worked up. Maybe he didn't sleep. Maybe he forgot something important. You know how he gets when he worries." The words spilled out like beads from a broken string, scattered directionless. He wasn't trying to convince me. He was trying to drown something out. His pacing scratched at my nerves, each footstep a reminder that this room, this family, no longer had a center. The space that used to feel safe now held too many moving pieces, none of which fit anymore. I looked from the trembling man on the sofa to the anxious young man wearing my son's face and felt a truth I had never felt before. At least one of them was lying, possibly both, and I had no idea which version of reality I was standing in. A subtle dizziness washed through me, not of the body but of the soul, the kind that comes when the ground beneath a marriage, beneath motherhood, begins to shift. Mark whispered something unintelligible, a fragile sound, thin and threadbare. "Mark," I murmured, kneeling in front of him. "Let's go to the bedroom. You need to rest." He didn't respond with words, but his hand reached for mine, a small broken gesture, and it was enough. I helped him stand. His legs quivered like a man learning to walk again. He leaned into me, not with trust, but with surrender. Ethan stepped forward abruptly. "Mom, shouldn't we call someone, a doctor?" The suggestion landed wrong. Too quick, too eager, too much like a detour meant to keep me from being alone with my husband. "I'll take care of him," I said quietly. Ethan's jaw clenched. "I'm just trying to help." But he didn't sound helpful. He sounded cornered. I guided Mark down the hallway. Each of his steps weighted with a kind of dread that seeped into me. His breaths came short, shallow, uneven. When we reached the bedroom, he collapsed onto the edge of the bed, like a man who had been holding himself together by will alone. I opened the drawer for the mild sedative his doctor had prescribed months ago for anxiety, for restlessness, never imagining I would one day give it to him because I feared what happened in our own home. "Here," I whispered, placing the pill in his shaking hand. He swallowed it with effort, his throat convulsing slightly, his eyes clouded with shame. Shame that didn't belong to him. Shame that belonged to someone else who had put it there. As he sank slowly onto the pillows, his eyes flickered open long enough to meet mine. In that split second, I saw something raw, a plea wrapped in terror. But the medicine began to pull him under, softening the edges of his panic, smoothing the tremors in his hands. His breaths lengthened, his muscles unclenched, his eyelids grew heavy. And then he was asleep. A deep, heavy, unnatural sleep of a man who had been living too long in a storm he couldn't name out loud. I sat beside him for a moment, watching the rise and fall of his chest, listening to the quiet, letting my thoughts settle into the spaces between heartbeats. The bruise, the flinch, the fear in his voice, the warning in his eyes. None of it made sense, and yet all of it did. I brushed back a strand of hair from his forehead and whispered almost to myself, "What have they done to you?" But the only answer was the fragile rhythm of his breathing. I closed the bedroom door quietly behind me and stepped back into the living room. Ethan was waiting. He stood in the center of the room like someone posing for a photograph, shoulders squared back, stiff hands clasped in front of him. The pacing had stopped. The frantic energy had been replaced with something eerily controlled. When our eyes met, he smiled. Not fully, not warmly, but just enough to show teeth. A small, polite smile held too long. A smile that didn't reach his eyes. A smile that felt wrong. As if he were mimicking an expression he had seen other people use but didn't quite understand the meaning behind. "Is Dad asleep?" he asked. "Yes. I told you he just needed to calm down." But his tone didn't match the reassurance. There was no relief in it. No softness. Just a thin layer of annoyance, carefully painted over something darker. Something that observed me. I stood still, studying the son I thought I knew, but the man in front of me felt unfamiliar. Like a stranger wearing Ethan's features, the same gentle mouth, the same eyes I used to kiss goodnight but emptied of something essential. He crossed his arms. A simple gesture, but it raised the hairs on my arms. "Mom," he said quietly, "you look upset. Upset." The words slithered into the silence. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because the longer I looked at him, the more a cold, steady truth settled into my bones. My son was not nervous. He was managing me, measuring me. waiting to see what I had figured out. I watched him watching me, his head tilted slightly, his expression unreadable, too controlled for a 20-year-old boy. His eyes flicked toward the hallway where Mark slept, then back to me. A calculation, a threat, a preparation. I felt something inside me tighten, coil, sharpen. Not panic, not yet, but awareness. The room felt different now, thick, tense, waiting. The clock ticked softly in the background, but even that sound felt intrusive, like it didn't belong in the silence Ethan was crafting between us. I took a breath. "Ethan," I said slowly, carefully, "sit down. We need to talk." His smile twitched. "About what? You know what." For a moment, barely longer than a blink, his expression dropped. Gone was the rehearsed calm, gone was the polite facade, and what remained underneath was something cold, something capable. Something that looked at me not as a mother but as an obstacle. Then, just as quickly, the mask returned. He stepped forward, slightly, hands in his pockets, voice light. "Mom, you're tired. We all are. Let's not make this complicated." But it already was. And his attempt to make it simple only confirmed what I had feared since the moment Mark flinched under my touch. Someone in this house was being hurt, and someone was hiding it. And both of those someones were standing in front of me. The wife, the husband, the son, a triangle with one side broken, and I was running my fingers along the fracture. When Ethan disappeared into the bathroom, closing the door with a soft, careful click, something inside me tightened, a quiet, instinctive knowing that this was the only moment I would get. A moment unobserved, a moment unmeasured, a moment before lies rearranged themselves into something harder to untangle. I moved, not quickly, not dramatically, just with purpose. My feet followed a path my mind hadn't fully planned yet. Down the hallway, past the framed photos of family vacations that now felt like artifacts from a life I wasn't sure I owned anymore, toward the small storage room Mark always kept locked. Except today, the door wasn't locked. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The hum of the security system greeted me first, a low, steady sound that had always comforted me before. Mark had insisted on installing cameras years ago for safety, he'd said. A precaution, nothing more. I had never imagined they would one day become the only witness to the truth he couldn't speak aloud. My fingers hovered over the monitor's controls before touching them. They trembled subtly but undeniably. I tried to steady my breath. It didn't help. Not when fear had already seeped into the spaces between my ribs. I replayed the morning. The footage started normally. Mark in the kitchen, moving slowly, making tea the way he always did, 2 minutes, no more, no less. A familiar rhythm. A ritual of comfort, the kind of ordinary moment that forms the fabric of a shared life. For a second, I almost let myself pretend nothing was wrong. But then the screen flickered, just once. A glitch, a pause, a warning. I leaned in closer. And then the world froze. Literally. The timestamp kept running, seconds passing minutes, ticking silently onward, but the image remained locked in place. Mark's hand midair, a spoon suspended above the counter, a moment trapped between frames. I pressed the rewind button. Then forward, then pause, then play. Nothing changed. 38 minutes. 38 minutes of absolutely nothing. No motion, no sound. No shift in light, no change in shadow. Just a single still frame carrying on its shoulders the weight of something terrible. My pulse thudded against my throat. My hands began to tremble more visibly now, my body registering what my mind was still trying to deny. Someone had done this. Someone had removed this. Someone inside this house. And then the footage resumed, abruptly, coldly, as if the world had simply snapped back into place. Mark was no longer standing. He was on the floor, curled in on himself, arms wrapped around his torso, one hand cradling his wrist, the wrist I had seen bruised, hidden clumsily beneath his sleeve. A sound escaped my lips, too soft to be called a gasp, but too broken to be anything else. I pressed a hand to my mouth. God. Mark. He lay there for several seconds, unmoving except for the faint shudder of breath. A man shattered quietly. Then, movement. Someone entering the frame. Ethan. My son walked quickly from the direction of the pantry, though his steps were controlled, as if he realized the camera might still be on him. His chest rose and fell rapidly. His hair was disheveled. He ran a hand through it once, twice, smoothing it back, in that way people do when they want to erase the physical evidence of something chaotic. I watched his fingers shake slightly. He glanced toward the doorway, then toward Mark. Not with panic, not with guilt, with calculation. As if measuring how much of the aftermath he needed to arrange before someone else saw it. Then he left the room. The footage ended its cruel confession, and I sat there, hands limp at my sides, staring at the blank screen long after the recording had stopped. My throat burned, my eyes stung, but no tears came, not yet, because something deeper than grief was crawling its way into my chest, a slow, suffocating realization that my family, the two people I had loved more than anything in the world, were no longer standing on the same side of truth, and I was caught in the space between them. A mother, a wife, a witness, a fool. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was too dry. The room felt tighter, smaller, as though the walls themselves had absorbed what I had just seen and didn't want to let me leave until I accepted it. I played the footage again. Every second, every frame. I forced myself to watch Mark fall, forced myself to watch Ethan enter, forced myself to see every detail my heart begged me to ignore. On the third replay, I noticed something else. Mark hadn't fallen forward. He had been pushed sideways. The angle of his body, the way his arm folded under him, the abruptness of his collapse. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't confusion. It was violence. Subtle, quiet, hidden between frames, but violence all the same. My fingers hovered above the pause button, but I didn't press it. I couldn't. The truth felt like ice crawling beneath my skin, leaving a trail of numbness in its wake. The kind of numbness that comes before pain, sharp, unavoidable pain. A ringing noise pulled me back into the present moment. Water running. Ethan. Still in the bathroom. I closed the monitor quickly but gently, not from fear of being caught, but from the instinctive knowledge that whatever I did next needed to be careful, deliberate, measured. Because now I wasn't simply a mother trying to calm a frightened husband. I was a woman holding a truth that could break us all apart. I placed my hand on the desk to steady myself. It didn't help. My legs felt strange under me. Not weak, disconnected. Like they belonged to someone else, some other woman with a different life who had no idea how she ended up inside this room with a version of reality she never wanted. I didn't cry. People imagine tears come easily in moments like this, but they don't. Tears are for sadness. This was betrayal. Betrayal doesn't cry. It freezes. I closed my eyes, letting the heaviness settle for a moment, letting the truth breathe, letting it take its place inside me, even as it rearranged everything I thought I knew. Then, the bathroom door opened. Footsteps, slow, measured. Like an actor entering a stage prepared to play the same role he had been performing all evening, the concerned son, the anxious boy, the helpful presence. I stood up, smoothing my hands against my sides, erasing the tremors the way I had seen Ethan erase the chaos from his hair in the footage. When I turned, Ethan was walking down the hallway. He smiled again. The same small, polite smile from before. But now I knew what it hid. Now I knew what it cost. Now I knew what kind of truth could sit comfortably behind teeth that straight. "Mom," he said softly, "is everything okay? You look pale." I looked at him, really looked and felt. Something inside me hardened, not with anger, but with a clarity so sharp it almost hurt. No, I said quietly. Then softer, I'm fine. The lie tasted like metal. His eyes narrowed just a fraction. Barely noticeable. Unless you had just watched 38 minutes of silence disappear from a camera your husband installed for safety, unless you had just seen your son walk away from a man curled on the floor, unless you had just realized the meaning of fear in your husband's eyes. He stepped closer. My breath slowed. My heart steadied. Because the truth, no matter how devastating, gives you something. Lies never do direction. And now I knew where to look, who to watch, what to protect, and how far I might have to go. Ethan tilted his head. Mom, what were you doing in there? I smiled. A small, careful smile, a mirror of his own. Oh, I whispered, nothing. And for the first time that day, that lie didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like survival. I don't know what time it was when Mark stirred beside me, only that the room was washed in the kind of darkness that makes everything feel heavier, more intimate, more dangerous. His breathing shifted first from shallow to ragged. Then his fingers twitched beneath the blanket. I opened my eyes. Mark, I whispered. He didn't answer. Not with words, only with a trembling exhale that carried something raw inside it. Then, barely audible, a fragmented whisper escaped his lips. Don't trust him. The words scraped the air like something wounded. I turned toward him fully, my heart pounding with a dull, terrible certainty. I leaned close enough to feel the warmth of his breath falter. Mark, I murmured, look at me. His eyes opened slowly, not like someone waking from sleep, but like someone returning from a place where fear sits in the bones, not the mind. Even in the dimness, I saw it, the reflection of something he had been trying to survive silently. Ethan, I started. Mark's face tightened instantly, as if the name itself hurt him. What did he do? I whispered. He shook his head at first, a weak, instinctive gesture of denial meant to protect someone or protect himself or protect me from knowing. But then his mouth trembled. His throat moved, working against the silence that had held him prisoner all day. He made me, his voice cracked. I held his hand gently, careful not to touch the bruised wrist, bruising more with every breath he took. Tell me, I said softly, almost pleading. Tell me the truth. Mark swallowed eyes, glistening but refusing to let tears fall. He made me sign, he whispered. His voice barely existed. Linda, I didn't want to. I told him no. The word sign dropped like a stone into my chest, heavy, cold, final. My throat tightened. What did he do to you? I wasn't sure the question even came out as sound. It might have been just breath. Mark closed his eyes for a moment, as if replaying something he desperately wished he could erase. He pushed me, he whispered, onto the table, hard. I couldn't keep my balance. I fell. Then he grabbed my wrist. He kept saying it was for the best, that I didn't understand, that I had to sign, that you wouldn't be able to handle things. My stomach twisted painfully. He grabbed you by force, Mark nodded. The bruises, the fear, the silence, the missing footage, it all aligned an ugly constellation, forming a truth I had hoped to outrun. And then I asked gently. Mark's lips trembled. I tried to pull away, he whispered. His voice was shrinking, dissolving into the darkness around us. He covered my mouth, told me to stop making things difficult, told me it would be easier for everyone if I just signed. A sound escaped me, not a sob, not a gasp, something in between, like a heart cracking in a way that's too old and too deep to make noise. I brushed my thumb over his hand. It's okay, I said, though. Nothing was okay. You're safe now. He shook his head. No, he breathed. No one's safe when he's angry. The words settled into my spine like ice. It was then, precisely then, that a soft knock came from the hallway. 3 quiet taps, measured, polite, wrong. Mark froze instantly, his entire body seizing with terror. He didn't breathe. Not really. Mom Ethan's voice floated through the door. "Is Dad okay?" That sentence, those exact 5 words, would have sounded caring to an outsider, but I had seen the footage. I had heard Mark's whisper. I had seen the bruise blooming like a confession beneath his skin. And so the words felt like knives wrapped in velvet. Mark's hand tightened around mine, not in strength, but in desperation. His lips formed a single word without sound. "Please." I squeezed his hand back. Then calmly, with a steady voice I didn't recognize as my own, I answered, "Yes, he's fine." There was silence outside, a long, listening silence. My heartbeat echoed in my ears. Finally, Ethan responded, his tone too smooth, too curated. "Okay, if you need anything, just call me." His footsteps faded down the hallway unhurried. I waited. 1 second, 2, 5, 10. Until I felt Mark's body slacken slightly beside me, the rigid paralysis easing only by a fraction, but I didn't relax. Not for a moment. Something irreversible had happened. Not physically, emotionally. Mark had reached his breaking point. And I had crossed a threshold too. One of those invisible lines in marriage, in motherhood, in faith and trust and loyalty, the kind that divides life into a before and an after. I brushed Mark's hair gently, hoping the gesture might steady him. It only made him shiver. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked softly. He shut his eyes, shame and grief folding into the edges of his expression. "Because he said you'd side with him. That you'd think I was confused, that I was getting old, that you trusted him more than me." My breath caught. "My God, Mark," I whispered. I wanted to hug him. I wanted to scream. I wanted to disappear. But instead I sat there holding his hand, feeling the bones beneath his skin fragile in a way I had never imagined them to be. "That's not true," I said. "I would never think that." Mark turned his head slightly toward me. "I know that now," he whispered. "But earlier, he was so angry. And when he grabbed me, his voice broke. He looked like he didn't even recognize me. My heart constricted, because I knew that look, that hollow place where empathy should be. That anger that doesn't belong to youth anymore, but something darker, a desire for control. "Mark," I whispered, "I believe you." He let out a breath he had been holding for hours, maybe days. I thought the fear might leave his eyes. But it didn't. Instead, a new fear entered. "Linda," he whispered, "you can't confront him. You can't make him angry. Not now. Not when we're alone with him in the house." Something cold tightened at the base of my neck. "I'm not confronting anyone tonight," I reassured him. He nodded weakly, but the fear didn't leave him. It sat between us, uninvited and immovable. I lay beside him, pretending to rest, pretending to breathe evenly. But my mind was running, quiet, organized, sharp. I wasn't thinking about revenge, not even justice. I was thinking about survival, his and mine. Because after tonight, after hearing the truth spoken through cracked whispers and broken breaths, I understood something with absolute clarity. My family had stepped into a darkness we couldn't simply walk back from. And somewhere beyond that door, my son, the boy, I had raised the baby, I had nursed the child, I had held through fevers and heartbreak, was standing on the other side of that darkness, waiting, listening, knowing more than he should. And I realized with a heaviness that settled into the marrow of my bones that the boy I once knew was not the one knocking softly on my door tonight. That boy was gone. And whoever remained, whatever he had become, was someone I no longer recognized. I didn't sleep, not even for a moment. Mark drifted in and out of uneasy half-dreams beside me, trembling every time the floor creaked or the pipes whispered through the walls. But I stayed awake, sitting listening, thinking, my back against the headboard, my hand resting protectively near his. Fear can exhaust a person, but betrayal does something different. It sharpens. It wakes. It turns you into a witness, even when your eyes beg for rest. When the first dull light of early morning touched the edges of the curtains, I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could. Every part of me was heavy, my arms, my breath, even my thoughts. But something harder, colder, more resolute kept me moving. I walked toward the hallway, and that was when I saw it. A small, aging camera mounted in the corner near the ceiling, half forgotten, coated with a thin layer of dust that time had settled there. Mark had installed it years ago, back when an attempted break-in had shaken him enough to over-prepare. Later, new cameras replaced it, and it became just another relic of an older worry, except it was still on. A tiny, steady red light blinked faintly, almost shyly, as if it wasn't sure whether to announce itself or stay hidden. My breath stalled. I stepped closer, slowly, carefully, afraid of hope almost as much as I was afraid of the truth. The newer system had been tampered with. But this one might still be honest. I took a chair from the hallway, climbed up and checked the wiring. Everything was intact, functional, neglected but alive. My chest tightened, not from fear this time, but from a strange, conflicted anticipation. If it had captured anything at all. My hands shook as I retrieved the small backup receiver hidden behind the cabinet, another forgotten piece of Mark's security obsession. I plugged it into the old monitor in the storage room, powering it on. The screen flickered to life with a faint buzzing sound, the kind that always made Mark mutter, "I need to replace that someday." I sat down, took a breath, pressed play. At first, there was nothing unusual. A quiet corner of the hallway, grainy but visible, part of the kitchen doorway. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was enough, a partial window into the morning that had shattered our lives. Then I saw movement. Ethan entering the frame. My son. Walking with a sense of purpose that didn't belong to a boy visiting his father. He pushed open the kitchen door, and though the sound didn't carry, I could see his mouth move, short, sharp words thrown into the air. Then Mark came into view. His shoulders were slumped. His hands trembled slightly. He shook his head. I froze the image there, staring at the shape of him, my husband of decades, a man who once lifted heavy boxes in the garage without flinching, now a fragile outline of himself. Then I pressed play again. Ethan's hand shot out. Fast, controlled. He grabbed Mark's wrist. The same wrist now bruised. Mark flinched, his entire body recoiling like an animal conditioned by fear. No, I heard myself whisper it, even though no sound existed in the footage. Ethan leaned in his face, inches from Mark, saying something I couldn't hear but could feel in my bones. Something that tightened Mark's shoulders, something that made his legs unsteady. Then he shoved him, hard. Mark fell sideways, hitting the edge of the kitchen table before collapsing onto the floor. His hand reached out instinctively, trying to find balance, but Ethan was already pulling something from his bag. A stack of papers. Thick, purposeful, prepared. I covered my mouth with both hands, but the urge to scream had nowhere to go. It stayed inside, burning through me silently, while Ethan knelt beside his father, forced the pen into his hand, and shoved the papers toward him. Mark shook his head again. He was crying, and I could see it in the way his shoulders jerked, the way his mouth opened without sound. The camera wasn't good enough to capture tears, but I didn't need clarity. The truth was clear enough. Ethan squeezed Mark's wrist again, tighter this time, twisting it. Mark signed, not willingly, not knowingly, but under force, under fear, under the hands of the son who once hugged him after nightmares. I pressed pause. The frame froze on Ethan's face, a look of cold determination etched into features I once kissed goodnight. My breath became a tremor inside my chest. Then, as if on cue, Ethan suddenly collapsed into theatrical sobbing. He held his head in his hands. His shoulders shook violently. He clutched at the papers as though he were the victim, heartbroken, frightened, overwhelmed. The performance was perfect, but the camera was indifferent. It simply recorded, and the truth sat there, pixelated but undeniable. I watched the scene again, and again. and again, until the muscles in my hands cramped and my fingers refused to unclench the controls, until my eyes burned as though grief itself had become a physical weight behind them, until the disbelief had nowhere left to hide. On the seventh replay, something inside me finally broke, not loudly but with a quiet, devastating surrender. My child, my little boy, my son. What was he now? What had he become? I tried to remember the softness of his infant fingers curling around mine, the smell of his hair after baths, the way he used to run into my arms without hesitation. But the images wouldn't come. All I could see was the frame frozen in front of me, Ethan towering over his father's broken body, tears he manufactured, sliding down a face that no longer belonged to the child I once knew. Something cold settled into me, then a realization that wasn't loud or violent but calm, measured, irrevocable. A mother's love can forgive mistakes. It can forgive failures, anger, even cruelty when remorse follows after. But this was something else. This was betrayal with intention. This was harm without remorse. This was a conscious decision to break another human being, and not just anyone, his own father. I leaned back in the chair, my body numb, my mind painfully awake. The monitor's glow mapped faint shadows onto the walls, shadows that felt like witnesses to my unraveling. I wasn't thinking about confronting him. Not yet. I wasn't thinking about screaming or demanding or even rescuing Mark from this terror. I was thinking about something far more terrifying. Tomorrow morning, Ethan would wake up believing he had control. He would walk into the kitchen with that careful, curated smile. He would speak to me with the sweet, practiced tone of someone playing the hero. He would hover around Mark with false concern, positioning himself as the caretaker, the rational one, the one who understood the situation. And I would be expected to play the mother, the trusting mother, the blind mother. But I couldn't unsee the frame in front of me. I couldn't unsee the bruise on Mark's wrist. I couldn't unsee the violence, the coercion, the performance. The truth had shape now. It had weight. It had become something alive, breathing against the back of my neck. And tomorrow would not be about breakfast or conversations or pretending. Tomorrow would be a confrontation, not a loud one, not yet, but a confrontation of truth between a victim and a betrayer. Between a wife protecting her husband and a son protecting his lies. Tomorrow, for the first time, would not be mother and son. It would be something else, something darker, something inevitable. I turned off the monitor. The room went dark, but the truth, the real truth, remained bright and merciless inside me, impossible to dim. Morning came without warmth. It drifted into the house like a thin, cold veil, pale light touching the edges of furniture, slipping over the floors where Mark had collapsed the day before. I watched him dress slowly, every movement dictated by pain he didn't speak of. When he buttoned his shirt, his fingers shook. When he reached for his jacket, I steadied him. Neither of us said much. Some silences are made of exhaustion, others of truth finally seen. This one was made of both. We left the house before Ethan woke. I had spent hours rehearsing what I needed to do, balancing fear with resolve, guilt with clarity. The footage from the old camera was downloaded, copied 3 times, sealed in my bag. I kept feeling for the hard shape of the drive inside my coat pocket, like touching a heartbeat that wasn't mine. Mark and I drove to the bank without speaking. It felt like we were moving through the residue of something broken, our marriage bruised, our family fractured, our son transformed into someone neither of us recognized. The sky outside the windshield looked colorless, washed out, as if the world itself had stepped back from us, watching quietly. When we arrived, I guided Mark through the glass doors. He stayed close, his breath shallow, as if the air itself were too heavy for him to pull in. We sat down in the waiting area. He stared at the floor. I stared at the door. And that was when it happened. Ethan appeared. He walked through the entrance with a confidence that felt like a blade, sharp, cold, intentional. His coat was perfectly straight, his hair combed back, his posture almost proud. When he spotted us, he smiled, Not warmly, not lovingly, not like a son seeing his parents. No, he smiled like someone approaching a transaction, a negotiation, a victory he believed had already been secured. Mom. Dad. He spread his hands slightly. I'm glad you came. We should get this sorted out properly. I felt Mark's fingers flinch inside mine. He looked away as if eye contact with his own son might shatter what little steadiness he had left. Ethan stepped closer. I talked to the bank, he said smoothly. They're preparing the documents. I'll help you handle them. It's better if I guide you through these things. Can be complicated. His tone was polite. Too polite. A rehearsed politeness. The kind you wear to hide a threat beneath. I lifted my chin. We're not signing anything. The shift in his expression was immediate, subtle but unmistakable. A muscle in his jaw tightened. The corners of his mouth twitched. His eyes darkened in a way that made my stomach pull tight. Mom, he said calmly, you don't understand how these things work, and you don't understand that I'm not afraid of you, I replied. It was the first time I had said it aloud. The first time truth and courage aligned inside me. Ethan blinked, taken aback. Just a fraction, but enough. Mom, he said with a slow exhale, people who are weak always lose everything. That's how life works. I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to protect what's ours. I felt nausea rise. Weak. Lose everything. Those were the words he had thrown at Mark. Those were the words that had turned love into leverage. And did you protect us by hurting your father? I asked. My voice sounded calm. Too calm. It wasn't courage, it was clarity, sharpened by betrayal. Ethan stiffened. Mom, don't play this game. I stepped closer, close enough to see the flicker in his eyes. Close enough to smell the faint scent of his cologne, the same one I once bought him for a birthday he'd forgotten to thank me for. You pushed him, I said softly. You grabbed his wrist. You forced his hand over signatures he didn't understand. And when you were finished, you cried in front of the camera like a child staging a tragedy. His breath caught. Just a flicker. But the truth struck him like a spotlight. You watched the footage. His voice dropped deep cold. Yes. I held his gaze. I saw everything. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply stared at me, and for the first time the mask slipped fully. Not anger, not fear, not remorse. Something darker, calmer, certain. You shouldn't have done that, he said quietly. Mark tensed beside me. I placed a hand on his arm, steadying him, steadying myself. Inside my coat, the police-arranged timer ticked softly 3 minutes until they arrived. Ethan took a step closer. You're making a mistake, Mom. Dad isn't thinking clearly. You're not either. You always raised me to be strong, remember? To take control of my future. That's all I'm doing. I'm taking control. You're destroying us, I whispered. No, he said, almost gently. I'm saving what's left. My throat tightened painfully. There he was, the boy I raised, the boy who used to cry over bruised knees, the boy who once asked if monsters were real. And there he was, too, the man who had become one. I forced myself to look at him without the filter of motherhood, without the longing to repair him, without the instinct to protect him. Just truth, just clarity, just witness. You hurt him, I said again. His jaw flexed. He wouldn't listen. He was terrified. He was wrong. I swallowed hard. Ethan, this is violence. The word traveled between us like a shard of glass. He recoiled not far, just enough to reposition himself. His posture shifted straighter, colder, more controlled. Then he exhaled slowly and said a sentence that sliced through me like a blade. Sometimes violence is the only way to get people to understand. My heart broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, the way a person breaks when they realize the one they love is already gone. I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, the doors behind us swung open sharply. Uniforms entered. 2 officers. Calm. Purposeful. Expected. I felt Mark's breath stop in his throat. Ethan turned. His confidence wavered only for a second, then returned reshaped into something colder. "Mom," he murmured, "what did you do?" I told the truth. The officers approached. Ethan Williams, one asked. He straightened, trying to compose his expression, but panic flickered beneath the surface. "What's going on?" he demanded. "You're under arrest," the officer replied, "for domestic assault, coercion, and attempted fraud." The lobby went silent. Customers stared. Employees froze. Ethan's face paled. "Mom," he hissed, stepping back as the officers moved toward him. "You don't know what you're doing. You'll regret this." "That's enough," I said quietly. His hands were forced behind his back. He struggled, not wildly, not violently, but in disbelief, as if the world had suddenly failed to obey him. "You're my mother," he shouted. His voice cracked anger, splintering into desperation. "You're supposed to protect me, not side with him." I stared into his eyes. Those eyes I once adored. Those eyes I once trusted. Those eyes now filled with something I couldn't name. "I'm not your protector today," I said softly. "I'm a witness." His breath hitched. His face contorted, rage, fear, betrayal twisting together. "You'll regret this," he screamed as the officers began to pull him toward the exit. "Both of you will," his voice echoed through the bank. And I felt nothing. Not victory. Not relief. Not even grief. Just a numbness so deep it felt like silence inside my bones. Mark leaned into me, shaking his breath unsteady. I took his hand gently, guiding him toward a chair away from the eyes watching us. Ethan's screams faded as the doors closed behind him. The last words he threw at me still hung in the air. "You will regret this." But I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because the eyes I used to look at my son with the eyes of a mother had disappeared. And what remained were the eyes of someone who had finally seen the truth and could never unsee it again. Ethan's screams were still echoing inside the bank's marble lobby when the glass doors closed behind him and the officers guided him toward the patrol car. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, a strange, hollow pause like the final reverberation of something that had finally snapped. I didn't watch the car drive away. I couldn't. I stood there, my hand resting lightly on Mark's trembling back, feeling the weight of his breath under my palm. His body felt fragile, too fragile for the man he once was, but there was something else in him now, something small but flickering. Relief. Or the first trembling seed of it. A bank employee asked if we needed a private room. I shook my head. Words felt too heavy to use. We walked outside Mark, leaning against me, his steps careful and uneven. The cold air struck my face like a reminder that the world kept moving, even when families collapsed in slow internal ways. Mark exhaled shakily. He looked at me, he whispered like I was nothing. I swallowed. "You're not nothing." But the truth stood between us. Our son had looked at him exactly that way. And no mother, no wife, no woman prepares for the moment she sees her child become the blade that wounds her family. We reached the car. I opened the door. Mark sat heavily rubbing his wrist as though the bruise still whispered. The drive home felt unreal. The sky outside was washed in muted gray, the streets quiet, the radio off. Every few seconds Mark would glance at me as if checking I was still there, as if afraid he might wake up to find the nightmare beginning again. "Did we do the right thing?" he asked softly. I didn't answer immediately. There are questions that require more than truth, they require courage. "Yes," I finally said, "we did what was necessary." We arrived home to a silence that didn't feel peaceful, but emptied like a house that had expelled something poisonous, but hadn't yet learned how to breathe without it. I helped Mark inside. He sat on the sofa, leaning back with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. I brought him water. He held the glass with both hands, as if anchoring himself. "Linda," he whispered, "I don't understand how we got here." I sat beside him. Neither did I. Parenthood had never warned me that love could one day be twisted into something unrecognizable. Motherhood never came with instructions for watching your child walk into darkness while you stood outside the door powerless. We stayed like that for a long time, two people who once believed their marriage had survived its biggest storms, now learning that even the walls of a peaceful home can harbor violence in silence. Later that afternoon, the phone rang. I knew who it would be before I picked up. A detective. Calm voice, professional tone. "Mrs. Williams, your son has been taken into custody. There will be a hearing. You and your husband will be notified." I thanked him. After the call, Mark looked at me with eyes full of grief, not just for what had happened, but for what had been lost long before we dared to see it. "He was our little boy," Mark murmured. I nodded. My throat closed. Yes, he was, and he wasn't. Night came slowly. Mark fell asleep early, exhausted in ways that medicine could not soothe. I sat in the living room with the lights off, the glow from the streetlights outside casting faint patterns across the floor. The house felt different now, not haunted but raw, like a wound still open. At some point I realized I was holding the memory drive in my hand, not consciously, almost as though my body had reached for it on its own. Evidence, proof, the truth that had broken us. I placed it gently on the coffee table as if it were something alive, and then the tears finally came. Not loud, not dramatic, quiet, steady tears streaming down my face in a way that felt almost cleansing. Not for Ethan's crime, not for the violence, not for the betrayal, but for the death of the illusion I had protected for so long that a mother's love alone could keep a child from turning into something dark. Days passed. We attended the hearing, sat behind the prosecutor, listened without speaking. Ethan was brought into the courtroom, wrists cuffed, hair disheveled, eyes hollow. He didn't look at us, not once. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, as if the world had turned against him, and he was the only one still standing. The judge reviewed the evidence, the footage, Mark's bruises, the forged documents. Everything spoke clearly, everything except our son, who remained silent, too proud or too broken to say a word. When the ruling came, custodial remand pending trial, my heart broke again. Not because of the sentence, but because Ethan still didn't look at me, not even to hate me. When we left the courthouse, the cold outside hit harder than usual. Mark took my hand. He looked steadier, firmer, but his eyes were older. "Will he ever forgive us?" he asked. I squeezed his hand. "I don't know." And that was the truth. Forgiveness isn't guaranteed. Not between parents and children, not between victims and perpetrators, not between any two humans broken by betrayal. But I also knew we couldn't survive on lies. Not anymore. We drove home again. The house welcomed us with silence, but this time it didn't feel threatening. Just empty. An emptiness we would have to learn to live with. I helped Mark to bed. He fell asleep quickly, his body finally letting go. I sat alone in the dark living room again, holding a cup of tea I didn't drink. The truth had cost us everything, but it had also saved us, and sometimes the price of survival is loss. A devastating, permanent loss. I closed my eyes and breathed. Not deeply, not peacefully, but with acceptance, because when love becomes blind, it becomes dangerous. And when truth finally arrives, it arrives like a knife, cutting what must be cut, freeing what must be freed. And I knew in that quiet room that I had finally become something I never wanted to be. Not just a mother, not just a wife, but a witness of truth, a witness of violence, a witness of the moment a family breaks and still chooses to keep living. Epilogue. A reflection for those who listen. 150-200 words. There is a truth we rarely say out loud. In Europe, in America, in any civilized corner of the world, Family is not always the safe place we promise it will be. Sometimes the danger grows inside the walls we built to protect ourselves quietly, gradually disguised as love. And when the moment comes to face that danger, courage does not look heroic. It looks tired. It looks ashamed. It looks like a mother signing a police statement with shaking hands. It looks like a man whispering fear in the dark. It looks like letting truth tear apart the illusions you spent a lifetime weaving. We like to believe love saves, but sometimes love blinds. And only truth, cold, merciless truth, can pull us back from the edge. If there is one thing I want anyone listening to my story to understand, it's this: silence protects the wrong people, truth protects the right ones. And there comes a moment in every adult life when we must choose which one we serve. I chose truth, and though it cost me my son, it saved my husband and myself. There comes a moment in every adult life when truth stops being gentle. It stops whispering and starts demanding. We don't choose when the people we love change, or when safety turns into silence, or when loyalty becomes a weight we can no longer carry. But we do choose whether to bow to that silence, or to stand in the light of what hurts. What I learned is both simple and devastating. Love is not an excuse to allow harm, and family is not a shield for cruelty. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is protect the vulnerable, even when the threat comes from someone we once held as a child. Truth does not heal everything. It doesn't restore what was lost. But it does draw a boundary, a necessary line between the past that shaped us and the future we deserve. If this story has stayed with you, if it made you breathe a little deeper or think about the quiet battles inside your own home, then I hope you carry its lesson with care. Courage is not loud. Courage is choosing truth when love alone is no longer enough. Thank you for listening. Until next time, take care of your heart.